start off so well. David is born into a family. His father's name is Jesse, and David's brothers are kind of this group of guys who are all hanging out together. And the Bible tells us in 1 Samuel that the prophet hears from the Lord that a new king is going to be anointed in Israel. And so God speaks to him and says, go to a man named Jesse, and Jesse is going to present you his sons. And so Jesse hears about this man named Samuel, and he gets all of his sons out in front of the prophet. He lays 7 sons out. What's the problem with this? He doesn't have 7 sons. How many sons does he have? 8. He has 8 sons. And the Bible tells us he lays all 7 sons out, but the prophet looks at each one of them and says, this isn't it, this isn't it, this isn't it. Do you happen to have another son? And Jesse's like, oh yeah, we don't like to talk about this guy, but he's out there hanging out with sheep. Now, let me give you a little bit of understanding of the context here. The Bible says that in the scriptures we just read that David was ruddy, bright-eyed, and good-looking. He was a good-looking dude, but he was a redhead. Any gingers in the room?
What? What's wrong?
Nobody? It's okay. It's okay. He was a redhead, and because he was a redhead, his brothers and his father actually thought that he was an illegitimate son. They thought he was conceived out of wedlock, and so he brought shame upon the family, so they stuck him out in the fields so nobody would know about him.
Wow.
Because he was a shame to their family. And so when the prophet shows up and says, look, God here is trying to label the new king of Israel. I need to find this dude that God has spoken to me about. Jesse says, here are my sons, but he doesn't bring David out. Now, before we talk about this process, I need you to understand a few things about labels. Because labels, although I know it's a silly subject to be talking about, is something that I've done some study in and researched a little bit about the properties of labels, because I believe so many of us are wearing them in this place this morning. And so I researched the properties of labels, and I came up with 2 things. And if you're taking notes, I want you to write these down, because we're going to come back to it at the end of the message. But a label has something on the back called an adhesive. Say adhesive. Adhesive. And the adhesive is what sticks that label to the product it is trying to define. Now, there are 2 properties of this adhesive that make a label successful. The first is that for a label to stick to something, it must be pressed. Say pressed.
Pressed.
A label, for it to be successful, must be pressed upon something that is not itself. The second property of a label is that the molecules inside the adhesive must be strong enough to hold, say hold, to something other than itself. So we got pressed, say pressed, and hold, say hold. Now, it's important that you remember those, because we're going to come back to them at the end of the message. But the prophet is looking for a new king to receive a new label, a new identity. And he goes to Jesse's house, and Jesse says, well, there's this guy out there in the fields, but we don't really like to talk about him. And in fact, he's kind of a shame to our family. But if you really want David, then I guess we'll go get him. And when I'm reading the story of David, I feel like this is the part where David gets his first label. Have you ever felt like you were overlooked?
Yeah.
Like nobody saw what you were doing? Maybe you were raised in a family where all of your siblings got the attention. Middle child, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Nobody pays any attention to you. Everybody else gets the attention. Everyone else gets the affection. And you are constantly overlooked. Maybe at your job, you've been working hard and you've been being faithful, but your boss just doesn't recognize the work that you're putting in. Or maybe you're serving a church and your E-team leader just doesn't recognize all of the work that you're putting in, and you feel overlooked. David, in this moment in time, gets his first label, because not only do his brothers forget about him, his own father. Can you say daddy issues? Your own father doesn't even notice you. But the story goes on about David. The Bible tells us that he makes it past this moment, and we read in 1 Samuel 17 that David's brothers are out fighting on a battlefield, and there's this guy that they're waging war against. He's a giant. You guys have heard me preach the message before. I'm a giant slayer. Remember, Goliath is hurling insults at the people of God, and so Jesse tells David, hey, go check on your brothers, bring them some cheesy bread, and let me know what's going on with them, because you're just a shepherd. You're not a soldier. Just be an informant for me and let me know what's going on. And so David goes out to the battlefield and he sees his brothers and he sees this giant named Goliath, and Goliath is cursing the God of Israel and slandering the armies of God. And David, he's got this gangster swagger in him, this holy grit, and he hears the insults and he says, are you kidding me? You're going to talk about my God like that? You talk about my people like that? I refuse to allow injustice to happen on my watch. And so David gets all riled up. He says, let me at him, man. I'll kill this guy. Yeah. And all the soldiers are looking at David and saying, bro, look at you. You're not a soldier, you're a shepherd. You ain't fit to fight this battle. This ain't your job. Go back to the sheep where you came from. And David, you know, he's kind of got that holy stupidness, just like, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do it. And so he says, no, man, I'm going to fight this battle. And so King Saul looks at him and says, all right, look, if you're going to be a soldier, then you got to look like one. And so I got some armor because I've fought some battles in my day. And let's see how you look in this armor. And you've read the story before. He tries on the armor, but what happens? The armor doesn't fit. Unqualified to do the very thing that God called him to do. Have you ever felt like God gave you a word over your life, but you have seen none of it come to pass? You don't come from the right family, you don't have the amount of money, you don't have the right relationships, or you may not have the resources, and so you feel called, but you feel unqualified. I know I got this big dream, God, but I don't have the education to do what you call me to do. David gets his next label. But the Bible tells us about David, and he goes on to fight Goliath, and some amazing things happen. He kills him, cuts his head off. It's great. And he starts to gain some popularity amongst the people, but just when you start to gain some traction and territory is when you start moving into trouble, because the enemy is not going to let you get so far without a fight. And so David begins to experience victory in his story, but King Saul is not happy about it, because not everybody is going to celebrate your success. Oh, I wish I had somebody to help me preach this message this morning. Not everybody is going to celebrate the successes in your life. And so King Saul starts throwing spears at David. Sends his armies after David, trying to kill David. David was just trying to fight for the armies of God, and now he's under attack. And what does this soldier do? This valiant man of God, David, killed Goliath. The Bible says he runs. Not only does he run, he hides in caves. And another story tells us that David enters into a city so afraid that he's going to be killed by the people in that town that he starts foaming at the mouth, acting like a lunatic so that he won't get murdered, because David's a little unstable. I mean, have you read the Psalms? Like one moment is praise the name of the Lord forever, and then the other is burn my enemies in hell. Like, he is unstable. This dude is not right in the head. He's freaking out. He's all over the place. He's unstable. He's crazy. David gets his next label. But what about Bathsheba? Y'all remember this girl? Y'all judge Bathsheba because she's out on the roof bathing, which, by the way, who does that? Who goes, takes a bath on the roof? You may not take a bath on the roof, but you post in Instagram photos. I'm going to leave that there.
Come on now. Say it.
Regardless, David is supposed to be out fighting a battle, but he stayed home hanging out, because you always fall into temptation when you're not where you're supposed to be. And David starts looking out his window, browsing around, scrolling on Instagram, and here he sees Bathsheba doing her thing, and he just has to have her. Problem is, she's got a husband. If you think the Bible is boring, you just don't read it like I do, because this is like a drama here.
Melrose Place.
David calls her into his chambers and has sex with a woman that is not his wife. Immoral, adulterer. Not only that, when he finds out that she has a husband, and the husband is a soldier in his army fighting the battle he's supposed to be fighting, you know what he does? He puts that guy in the front lines where he's going to get killed and has the man murdered.
Wow. All right, come on.
Man after God's own heart.
Come on.
I have a problem with this. Because when I read the story of David, every time he gets himself into a situation, he gets himself into trouble.